Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to explore something that I'm sure many of you will be fascinated by. Do you ever find yourself trying to succeed in a particular area, but yet you find that somehow you seem to sabotage or stumble along the way before you ever reach your goal? Or perhaps there's a particular pattern or behavior that you have that you consistently do, and you know it's kind of holding you back, and you're not feeling very fulfilled or very happy in the meantime, and trying to figure out, why do I do this particular thing? There was a day that I was carrying my granddaughter through the hallway, and I was showing her pictures of the family that were hanging on the wall. And I said, you know, Liliana, which is the name of my granddaughter, I said, take a very good look at these people on the wall here. I want you to come to understand that who you are isn't entirely your fault. But at the same time, in knowing that you are an extension of all of these people and even people before those people, you can come to understand perhaps the patterns and the dynamics within your lineage that cause you to be who you are today. And if some of those ways that you are aren't satisfying, perhaps there's a way you can change that. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a licensed psychotherapist, a shamanic practitioner, soul healer, international lecturer, and ordained minister. He is author of several best-selling books, which include Sacred Ceremony, Animal Spirit Guides, and Earth Magic. He's joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program to talk about how we can heal our ancestral karma. The book is titled Healing Ancestral Karma. And I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Stephen Farmer. Dr. Farmer, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. I loved your story about your granddaughter. That's great.
Well, you know, actually, it was funny because I kind of stole that line from a movie that I thought was and I've quoted this movie many times on the program, especially in this kind of subject matter, because it had a lot to do with forgiveness, and it was a movie called My Life, starring Michael Keaton. Are you familiar with that one?
No, I'm not, although I'm writing it down right now.
But, you know, he starts off, you know, just quickly, the premise is he starts off the movie, he's recording himself because he is in what is about stage 3 or stage 4 cancer. And he feels he's going to die before his unborn child, comes along. So he wanted to make a video so that way the child can come to know who he was just in case he doesn't survive this before the birth of the child. And it's a fascinating movie about healing, you know, about forgiveness and about understanding, you know, you can't point your fingers and stay angry about what your parents maybe did or didn't do. You know, just embrace life and enjoy who they are in the first place. And that's what I really love about this book here. It's showing how we're the sum of those many parts there, but we still have the empowered, you know, place that we can actually do more to continue that lineage and the strength of all of its positive attributes as well.
Right, and I think one of the most fascinating things, Daniel, in my research, I actually started teaching workshops on this subject, about 4 or 5 years ago. And then it occurred to me, I got a lot of material, and there's so many things I discovered that I wanted to put it together, and of course that resulted in the book, Healing Ancestral Karma. One of those things, though, that it's a little bit, how would I say, it's kind of hard sometimes to get your head around this concept, but based on my experience, it's really true. And that's that when we do any kind of healing with ourselves, not only do we benefit in our offspring, our descendants, even beyond, let's say, 1, 2, 3 generations, benefit from that healing, but it goes backwards and forwards. In other words, it goes forward to our descendants, but it also goes backwards, interestingly enough, to those in the afterlife, because as I've said many times, when we're dead, we ain't done yet. You know, we still have an evolution to go through. And as you noted in the book, there's a lot of evidence, not scientific proof, but certainly a lot of anecdotal evidence, tons of it, that mediums that are able to access deceased loved ones or ancestors that do come through with details about their lives, etc., near-death experiences where someone's died and actually come back, that there's report after report after report that says there's something going on after we die, and that the spirit of our deceased loved ones can come to visit us. Another friend of mine, Sonny Don Johnston, the medium psychic, as she put it, she said, we're all mediums to those that we're closest to. Anyway, my point really is that we have you could say, a spiritual evolution to go through in the afterlife as well. I've had experiences where my father and my mother have come through, and there's been this incredible healing on both sides. My mother, who never really got who I was, and I was kind of a weird kid too, and it's a long story I won't go into, but she's come to me on a couple of occasions, and there's been this sort of, I would call it this natural forgiveness. You know, it's not something that I sought out to do. It's just as a result of her appearing to me and communicating certain things to me. And this is without an intermediate, without a medium. It happened under different circumstances. It has, I know, allowed her to move on in her own evolution in the afterlife, and it certainly has helped me to, how would I say, I guess, again, a natural kind of forgiveness. I say natural because it wasn't something I set out to do. It's a deeper understanding of the fact that she went through a lot of abuse, that she was raised in a very harsh environment. She was one girl amongst, with four brothers, poor woman. So I really feel like my work really is complete with her, and I know that she has moved on in her own evolution. Anyway, that's probably the most astounding concept that has really come out of this research and this work, is that, as the Course in Miracles has said, when I am healed, I am not healed alone.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's really fascinating when you consider the afterlife and the idea of what does happen after death. And we certainly have a difficult time trying to find one way or the other whether there is more after this. I suppose that's why we fear death so much.
Right.
But apparently, you look through the centuries of human evolution, and I don't know that you can say that people make up the fact that, okay, we travel over to the spirit side or we go to the kingdom of God or wherever it is we go. Well, we certainly seem to go somewhere, and there's a very strong belief multiculturally all over the world that there is something else after this.
Right.
And in knowing that, or at least feeling that you know that, you feel a sense of personal responsibility and empowerment about what to do while you're still in this waking life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very astute comment. We all, I think, when you're, how shall we say, I guess, called to this awakening process, which is continually like peeling away layers and layers that prevent us from really becoming who we came here to be in our own evolution in this lifetime. That we try to do our best and clean up a lot of the stuff. I think particularly in this generation and in this, I would say even certainly the coming generations. I see this with my daughters who are now in their 30s, how they have worked really, really diligently to clean up the, shall we say, the sins of their fathers and mothers. You use that as a metaphor. And I know that I look at my own fathering with the girls and how, because of my tendency to be addicted to work, that classic workaholic in the time when they were a little younger, I wasn't as available as I believe I, could have been had I known better. But then I look at my legacy, which was my own father, my dear beloved father, who really worked really, really hard to maintain not only myself as the youngest of four, but the three older siblings, my two brothers and sister, had a different father. So he married my mother, brought these children on board, and then they had me. And my modeling with my father was he was pretty distant. And I realized, as time went on and I did my own healing work, one of the reasons he was distant is he really worked hard. He was a construction worker, drove the heavy equipment and such. And also he was alcoholic too. So those elements I think really cost him. That was his way of shielding himself. Mm-hmm. And I see in my own way of having raised my girls that or participated, I should say. I don't want to take full credit for the beautiful beings that they are today. But I could see how I was really, through my, I was teaching at Saddleback College. With a partner, I'd opened a retail store, and I was doing my private practice as a psychotherapist, so I was a busy man. And often at the end of the day, much like my father, speaking of ancestral karma, I would come home and it was like all I wanted to do was just, have a meal, sit and watch TV and just kind of veg out,
Right, exactly.
So that is an aspect of me that I know has I hesitate to say healed, but because of the work that I've done, the therapy and the encounter trainings and this and that and whatever, and the spiritual work, particularly the spiritual work in the last several years, I really feel like that's healed. Like, okay, when I'm with my kids or children or my nephews or nieces or my now two, interestingly enough, two stepdaughters, I really want to be with them. I want to be present fully.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm not, then I need to address that in some way. But it's a different way of operating than what I modeled from my own father.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't explain that very well, but that's one example of healing ancestral karma.
Mm-hmm.
The other idea, Daniel, too, is not all that ancestral karma is something we want to lose or get rid of or heal or cure. Mm-hmm. One example I think of is my mother's sense of humor. I feel like somehow I've gotten some of that genetic material somehow of being able to not take things too seriously too often. And believe me, I used to be a very serious child and a serious young man, but I somehow, now that I've matured, shall we say, depends on whether you ask my wife or not, but
Don't tell me you're beating yourself up like your father used to do to his father and so forth.
all that stuff. So anyway, it goes on, and I think we're in a really interesting time, to say the least, with this shift that's been occurring in human consciousness and how many of us are called to, like I say, to do all that healing, to really clean up the stuff that we have been handed through our ancestors. And second is to honor the ancestors, like you made that comment with your mom, your mother and your father. You get to a place where you realize, not just a philosophy or a concept, but they really did in terms of what they've been handed, they did the best they could.
Right.
But you have to, I think, really touch someplace inside you of compassion and understanding to really get that at the deepest level possible so that you could move on.
I think it's interesting you bring that up. I remember it was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, I had happened to read a short little article where Bill Gates was addressing a high school class, a graduation class. And one of the things he said is, when you have a rough time out there in life, as every one of us usually do, he says, I don't want you blaming your parents. Who you are is not entirely their fault. It's by choices that you make. And taking that particular piece of responsibility and saying, okay, if I am, then how can I make things different? And the funny thing when you use the word karma, I've talked with many people about this, whether it's been on the radio program or just outside of this a realm here and just out there, regular talking with people. It seems the word karma has a very confusing definition for a lot of people, yes, especially with the fact that there are quite a few people that believe you're bound by karma, much in the same way that we used to believe that we were bound by genetics. And we know scientifically now that that's not entirely true anymore.
Yeah, the whole science of epigenetics, I think, has fairly new science, has actually demonstrated and proven scientifically that by any kind of healing work we do, we actually alter the way that the DNA expresses through the genes. We can't change our DNA. That's it. My eyeballs are going to be blue no matter what. But we can change the way that the DNA expresses through the genes. And it can be, it can be affected by, even negative things like toxins. It definitely is affected by trauma. And that's one of my pet subjects is trauma and post-traumatic stress response, because it alters the way the genes express. And the good news is that you can also then alter them in the direction that's more favorable by doing the work that you need to do. I myself as an example, not to go into a lot of story about this, but just peeling away the layers and layers and layers. When we're little, we do what we have to instinctively to survive. Our instinct creates these adaptations that allow us to survive. It's an organismic, instinctual process. And that takes away from the blame. You're handed not just from your parents, but from your grandparents, from your great-grandparents, down the line. So what parents may do to try and raise their children, they could be great parents, and there could be one or two incidents that so dramatically affect the child that the child creates instinctively an adaptation to those circumstances. Dad who never yells, has trouble, he's depressed, and he goes through a cycle of depression, and he's a lot more temperamental than usual, and you as a very sensitive child take that in as something's wrong with me, something's my fault, and then you start to create a whole system of thought and belief about that. And then you go around and you develop into an adult that goes around feeling this kind of, having a shame-based behavior because that's what it took to adapt to the circumstances of your father, who was ordinarily a pretty good guy and a pretty good dad, who would yell and go through these periods of yelling. As one example, and then you carry that karma with you. Karma, in this sense, is not I think the more classic definition of karma would be coming from Hinduism and Buddhism, and that's that whatever was happening in your previous lifetime that you didn't clean up, you carry it into this lifetime. And then what you don't clean up in this lifetime, you have that to carry over into your next lifetime. That's the origination of that word karma. Mm-hmm. I've taken a little bit of liberty with that in calling it ancestral karma is those patterns that you carry from your ancestors, not from past lives, that continue to affect you until they are modified through some proactive stance and movement on your part. Mm-hmm. Whether that's through therapy, a spiritual process of some sort, any number of ways. There's thousands of ways that are available for us to do this healing. And as you pointed out, we're at a time now where we understand more clearly that we can change our karma, and we can change it through the genetics, we can change it through our belief system, we can change it through our spirituality. There's a number of approaches. We can change it by healing the trauma. There's some incredible processes that will help us heal the residuals of the trauma, the post-traumatic stress disorder. And I don't like that word disorder. It's post-traumatic
as though there's an ordered way we're supposed to be doing things, and life keeps proving that's not true.
Oh, good point, Dan. Yes, I like that. I like that way of thinking about it. It's a response. Mm-hmm. It's a response that we develop under extraordinarily overwhelming circumstances, whether it's human caused or whether it's natural disasters. Mm-hmm. Although we tend to be able to recover from natural disasters more quickly. But when you're 6 years old or 7 and you get repeatedly told that you're no good and I wish I never had you, things like that, those things go really, really deep.
Well, sure they do. And I know as you were describing an example of, how we tend to hold on to those belief systems that somehow we came to learn. And that's also part of it as well, as these are belief systems we come to learn. And for some reason, I was thinking of the movie Forrest Gump. And I liked when there was that scene where Forrest Gump meets with Lieutenant Dan and talks briefly about his history, about how every father and grandfather and so forth had died in every single war, so he believed that was his destiny. That is Lieutenant Dan. His destiny was to die in the war, but he gets saved. Yeah. So now your question is, what are you going to do now?
Good point, yeah. It's like the saying that somebody comes to believe, cancer runs in our family.
Right.
Bingo. Well, keep saying that, keep believing that, and guess what? The forces that be will conspire to encourage your body to create that, in a sense, not like it's a conscious decision to do so. But the belief itself is, I think we well know, the beliefs, especially core beliefs like that, beliefs that, let's say are well rehearsed and become core beliefs about ourselves. I'll never amount to anything. How many times, if someone was told that, what do you think they create in their life? Well, I'm never going to amount to anything. So they face failure after failure, and they get to prove themselves right in a way. Mm-hmm. So those kind of beliefs just can be nasty.
Mm.
On the other hand, I was thinking of a fellow that I saw I worked with in a private session that, gosh, he was treated like gold, by his family and his mother, and he was a boy in a Middle Eastern type family, and in that particular culture, I won't say which culture that is, but let's just call it Middle East. That in that culture, males are revered, and in this particular family, he was revered. He told me how, he was all but worshipped, and he's been very, very successful on a number of counts. And I met him, and he's a really good guy. I really like him. He's very easy to get along with. He's very respectful. He's learned those kind of social appropriate behaviors, etc. He succeeded very, very well, and that was his karma that that was passed along from his mother and father, and from their mother and father. And his father was very, very in a very similar vein. It's just interesting, and it's cultural too. But how he carried these beliefs that he was really all right. He was pretty cool.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, he was able to succeed quite well in the material world.
Yeah, and it's so fascinating because you also hear just the opposite, where people were born into this lifetime. In fact, a really fascinating story I remember reading many years ago was of two brothers that were born pretty close to the same time. And they were born into a family where the father was extremely abusive. And then over the years, as they both grew up under these same conditions, one of them eventually went to prison, and the other one became a very successful business person and influencer in the community that he was in. They were both interviewed, and they both had the same answer to the question about how they came to be who they are, especially in light of the circumstances they grew up in. And the answer was simply, because I didn't have a choice. That's interesting.
Yeah, no, that's a great story too. Yeah, I was thinking also, it made me think of the twin studies that oh gosh, I'm trying to think of a good example, and nothing comes to me right now, a specific example, but twin studies that show when the twins are separated at birth. There's some classic anecdotal stories about twins separated at birth, and it seems like there's one of two versions of that. One is that they meet up later and they go, whoa, they have all these similarities. They both married a fellow named John, and they both had, an operation when they were 22, things like that that were fascinating parallels in their lives, in spite of the fact that the environment itself was not the critical factor in what happened in their lives. And then other stories, like the twins that were separated at birth, that are very similar to the story you just portrayed, which was they may have some similarities, but they've taken different paths. And the abuse, like you mentioned with the story you mentioned, Daniel, the abuse itself could result in someone going, okay, I'm not worthy, I'm no good, might as well end up proving it and continuing to act out and to get caught and to be imprisoned. And then another version of that would be, well, the abuse made me tougher. It made me so strong, and I knew that I was not going to cave to that abuse, that there was some other element in that particular individual that caused them to respond completely differently to the same circumstances as a brother or a twin. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that there's any easy way to explain something like that, but certainly when you think of ancestral influence on that, not only mom and dad, but grandma and grandpa. There's a fascinating exercise. This is actually what started the ball rolling for me, as I came across this process with ancestors and started to introduce it in a workshop. And I attribute it to a fellow, a British writer named David Furlong, who wrote a book some years ago, Healing Family Patterns, I think it was called. And it was so fascinating. And so I ran this exercise in different workshops. It's so fascinating to me. What I'll describe it briefly is the individual, the client, or the person in the workshop. We'll call him client. The client then thinks of a condition that they would like healed with the help of their ancestors. And of course, the premise is that your mom and dad are ancestors. They're deceased loved ones. Yeah, but let's call them ancestors, because every other culture, that's brash of me to say that, but most other cultures, I would say, really have a place for their ancestors in their lives. We don't think of that particularly. We don't think of grandma and grandpa as ancestors. They're deceased. Grandma and grandpa are deceased loved ones. Anyway, So the individual, Daniel, will think of a condition, whatever. Like, let's say it's an addiction, of some sort. They'll think of that condition. They'll focus on it. Then through this meditative process, what we do is ask the ancestors one layer at a time, mom, dad, and then grandma, grandpa, and then great-grandma, 3 generations, and put them in chairs in 3 rows in front of them. And then we ask God or Spirit to help them, or Spirit helpers or allies or whatever you want to call that, but some source that's beyond their usual conscious mind to help identify more accurately the ancestor that most carries that same condition, like the addiction. And let's say it's grandpa on mom's side. Okay, there's a light shown on grandpa, or he stands up, or you just kind of know that it's grandpa, and you send healing to them across time and space into the afterlife. And it sounds, as I say, it sounds a little woo-woo, but it really isn't. It's a little more abstract in some ways, but when you go through it in that deep state of relaxation, I really know and believe from my own experience, you're able to get through that veil. So you send, basically, with the help of spirit guides, you send love and light to this ancestor, not trying to direct it to make him healed, but you send it to him and then let the light, the healing light of the celestial realm, let's call it, do its work, whatever it needs to do to heal that condition. And then they send it back to you, you receive it, and you send it to your descendants. And that's a quick explanation of the exercise. It's a little, it takes usually about 20, 30 minutes to go through the whole thing. But out of that exercise, Daniel, I've received some fascinating stories about people that have done this exercise and found themselves actually experiencing that healing, and also trusting and knowing that somehow that the ancestor was able to benefit. And I'll tell you one short version of that. I received a letter, an email from a woman who had been in the workshop, and she said, Dr. Farmer, I had this dream last night, and it was my grandfather that I worked with. And the dream was this: I'm walking in the woods, and I see a fire. And I look, and I see that there's a bunch of men that are circled around this fire. So I walk a little closer, and then as I get within a few feet of what was going on there, I noticed that the man's back toward me was my grandfather that I'd worked with.
Wow.
And he turned to me in the dream. He turned to me and said, "Thank you. I can now sit in circle." That to me that makes me want to keep doing my work. That there's something going on. And it's an anecdote. It's a dream, though. And in dream time, when we dream at night, again, I think we cross that veil between this life, the physical life, the material world, and the world of the typically non-visible realm of the afterlife. And this woman, again, who reported this, it's actually, the story's in my book, too. She gave me permission to use it. Really felt like it was effective not only for her grandfather, but for herself in healing her concerns.
It's interesting, too, because you feel yourself bound by that without realizing why. But at the same time, as you begin to heal, release, forgive, whatever it is that the intention is, and something like what you were saying with your grandfather, how he turns to you and says, "Thank you, I can now join the circle." It wasn't your fault that he was outside of the circle, but it was that you were able to place him where he yearned to go. That would give you a lot of emotional freedom, wouldn't it?
Yep. Oh, absolutely. Mm-hmm. I mentioned, my mother coming to me. She's come to me on more than one occasion. My brother has, my father has. And again, as to quote Sonny Don Johnson, we are all mediums to those we're closest to. I bet you if you surveyed everyone listening to this right now, I'd say probably at least half, if not more, of the people could say, "Oh, yeah." Even my sis, Daniel, my beloved sister who I love so much, who lives in Iowa, she's, what is she now? She's in her 70s, 78 or something like that. Lost her husband. Her husband died about 2 years ago. A long, protracted illness, and it was like, okay, it's time. He let go. And she's pretty much a meat and potatoes Midwestern Cedar Rapids, Iowa gal. You know, she's just like really the salt of the earth kind of thing. And I just love her. I just adore her. You know, she's just a sweetheart and, you know, very innocent soul. And I could go on and on. You could tell. You could tell how I feel.
Right.
But I asked her, I said, you know, because of this work with the ancestors and healing, I said, you know, Nance, I got to ask you something. You ever sense or see Jim around you? Or she said, oh, yeah. Like, just like that, no hesitation. And I said, well, really, do you see him? And she said, no, I don't really see him. I'm trying to talk like she does. I don't really see him, but I can feel him here. You know, that's good enough for me. And that's often, people may not be able to visualize or close their, you know, in their mind's eye or something, but they'll sense the presence of deceased loved one. My mother, I said I was kind of a messed up kid, and, you know, my adaptations to the circumstances of an alcoholic family, which tremendous amount of healing I've done on that, a lot of work. And I don't really hold any energy on my mother or father at this point because I know they were handed what they had, et cetera, and all that. But one of the things that happened that was very, very, very significant is several years ago, even before I even thought about ancestors and ancestral healing, I'm in Oregon with my partner at the time, and she and I were visiting her brother and her sister-in-law, and I had never met the sister-in-law. I'd met the brother. And I learned, as a conversation with the sister-in-law, Maria, and again, the story's in the book as well, I learned that she was psychic. And she was like really hesitant about it, though, and I said, well, and she explained that her mother and her mother and grandmother were also psychic, but they fooled around with I forget the term she used was like the dark forces. And so she was really not. She says, I've only done like 3 readings in my whole life because of it makes me nervous. So of course I go, well, you know, I'd love to have a reading if you're open to it, and she agreed to it. So we went outside. She started in, Daniel, talking about my mother. She came up with detail after detail. And what she did is she touched this deep core of this, the best way I can describe it is this deep-seated pain of just her not knowing who I was, not being able to see me. I know now it's not her fault, you know, but at that time it was like I had to feel the depth of my pain.
Right.
I was totally unprepared for that. I was a zombie, Daniel, afterwards. You know, it was like so emotionally evocative that the only thing I could do, which was a very old familiar pattern, is to shut down. And that's what we do if we're overwhelmed. And I was overwhelmed, so I shut down. Walked in, and my partner Cindy and I were going to go camping outside of Portland, just outside Portland. And so Cindy drove, we went out there. I didn't say a word, I couldn't talk. Went out there, we got set up on a picnic table in the campground, and I took out a notebook where I always wrote stuff, and I started writing. I don't know what I was writing, I can't even remember. And the tears started coming, just slowly. And then, the capper was this, is that as I was writing, I heard my mother, just as if she was 2 feet away, talking in my ear, saying, now I see who you are. And then the floodgates opened.
Wow.
To touch something very deep inside me and to be seen, it took for her to die and go into the afterlife and do whatever healing took place there. And from that perspective, she really got me. And the whole characteristic of the mother or the mothering one for an infant and a child is to serve as a reflectivity. You know, the baby smiles, mom smiles. You know, the baby cries, mom goes, ooh. And not that I didn't have that at all, but there was something really basic that was missing in that relationship. And I of course, took it on. I adapted to it by shutting down, by putting layers between me and everybody else so that I could protect myself. And that got me through it, got me through adulthood, but never really having a way to heal that core pain. And by that experience alone, Daniel, it feels like something just completely shifted in me. Mm-hmm. It was strange and wonderful at the same time. Mm-hmm. Anyway, that's a fairly involved story, but it gives another demonstration of how not only was that healing for me, but I know it was for her. And it moved into a place of what I call a natural forgiveness. And that's not where I go, oh, I forgive you, Mom. There's nothing, the word didn't even matter. It wasn't the word. It was the feeling of compassion and understanding that I received from her, and then further on, in other ways, the compassion and understanding I could feel for her, that she was a messed up human being, just like the rest of us. She had her own version of being messed up, just like I had my own and everybody else does. But that there was an opportunity for her to come through from the afterlife and to basically offer this, I would call it blessing, Daniel, of being seen for the very first time in my life, being fully seen for who I am.
Yeah, the story reminds me of a wonderful interview I did a few years back. It was The Afterlife of Billy Fingers, how my bad boy brother proved to me there's life after death. And to give you an idea about this, we posted that interview on our YouTube channel, which is 50 Beyond for the listeners out there. But here's an idea behind once we post this interview, which goes for about an hour long. This was a lady out of, I believe, North Carolina. She's also a doctor. And she really didn't believe too much in the afterlife or spirits, so forth and so on. It wasn't that she was cynical or anything like that. It's just probably like a lot of us until we experience something like that. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't true. We don't know. But in this particular case, her bad boy brother, Billy Fingers, came to her. He had a really rough life, lots of drugs, in and out of jail, that sort of thing. But he was coming back, and he was talking with her, and she was surprised by the experience she was really beginning to have. And, of course, she wrote a book about this. Now, just to show, the reality of how we really somehow inherently know there must be something more after this life, is this thing has now more than almost 30,000 views.
Wow.
Its likes to dislikes are interesting because there's 281 likes to 6 dislikes. So that's a pretty interesting ratio when you look at this, that people are probably wondering a couple of things. A, what do we do in the afterlife? But how do we empower ourselves to live better in this one? And that's the interesting thing about your book and Healing Ancestral Karma, especially the story that you just told about your mother, is that it's very possible. It's just a matter of, A, stepping into that and just simply saying, what if? And what are the steps that I need to take so that this can occur for me now?
Well stated. And I think, my thought about that is, of course, the bubble of the baby boomers, of which I am one, and your radio show Beyond 50. I think, the closer we get to that gate, that's like I said to somebody yesterday, I said, it's over the horizon. I don't know how far it is over the horizon, but, I know it's there. I think we have more awareness as we age, and I'm in my 60s, so, I feel very fortunate that I've made it this far, given some of the circumstances in my life. Like, this is a blessing. Every day is a blessing, and really try to live that and not just have it espoused as a philosophy, but really appreciate the fact of existence, that I get an opportunity to live on this beautiful planet with all the stuff that's going on. The planet's changing, and, we get a lot more media and electronics and all this stuff that people could, kvetch about. But the truth is, when I go outside or I look at my little granddaughter who's here, my little almost 4-year-old granddaughter, I go out and I just kind of sit with a tree or something like that, breathe with the tree, put my feet in the dirt, grow a garden, and all those kind of magical things that happen on this planet. It's just exquisitely, it's just exquisite to experience it this way. So I think maybe we're, the closer we get, like you mentioned, the number of hits versus, the number of likes versus dislikes, is people are going, they're wondering about this.
Right.
My
and there's a hell of a conversation thread that's on that video as well that you should check out as well, or have the listeners just what people are talking about. It's just wow. You don't expect. We'll put it out there, but let's just see what happens. And it's really amazing some of the things that you experience through something like that. But as you were saying,
again, what's the name for the listeners?
It's called The Afterlife of Billy Fingers. And it's how my bad boy brother proved to me there was an afterlife. And what I wanted to kind of touch on, because you were mentioning it just earlier in the program, and I know this is one of the exercises that you have, but there are two friends that we have that have actually implemented this particular practice, and it was really interesting to go to the one friend's house who invited a few people over, and as a group we co-participated in the practice of what's known as family constellation therapy. And I think that was such a fascinating one because this person who implemented the practice had such a unique way he would take and he'd say, okay, I want you to go ahead and move and stand right here. And then he'd go over to another person and position them, and he'd say, well, in this person here, you go ahead and sit down, and if you don't want to participate for this person over here, that's okay. And you would see some really interesting, weird things happening, but you knew inside it was resonating with you because you would feel sometimes these emotions thinking, what am I feeling this for? This isn't even about me. But in fact it is, because we're allegedly all interconnected.
Yeah, absolutely, and we are in this matrix of consciousness, and the consciousness extends far beyond the visible realm as well. And that you can actually, apparently, it sounds like, Daniel, you experienced this too, in not just observed, but experienced it, but you call on, the practitioner sets it up so that there's certain positions that each of the family members, and even beyond the mom-dad generation, but beyond that, how they're positioned, and then suddenly they're, you could say, channeling Grandpa. They can feel what Grandpa was feeling. They can go into detailed history. They can talk about instances sometimes. They can go really deep. So now, how do you explain something like that? How do you really explain that? Yes, we're all connected in that way, and that by participating in a process that such as the family constellation therapy, there's this magical, mystical sort of process that takes place, and that's that the different members of the group who are enacting the dynamics of the family start channeling or experiencing similar feelings as Grandma, Grandpa, Mom, Dad, even Uncle Joe, if he's involved too. It's a fascinating experience. It's interesting. It kind of converged. For me, it converged with the ancestral stuff, and I had more than one person saying, that sounds like family constellation therapy. And I said, well, even though I didn't do that in my psychotherapy days, I do understand it, and I've actually watched it one time, and it was very interesting to see what was going on with the different pieces of the family that were coming through. It was fascinating.
Now, speaking of fascinating, I was going to mention with the other friend, because you were talking earlier about cultural karma. Now, the big one I know a lot of people are familiar with is the Jewish community. Here is a culture that's basically been kicked out of just about everywhere they've landed.
Yeah.
Now, this other friend of mine, she brought up something that was really interesting some years back, and it left me scratching my head thinking, that's really an interesting perspective, and that is this. Part of my culture is Native American. And there was one puzzling thing that I had happening in my life where as things seem to get really good, somehow something comes along and takes it away from me. And I could never figure that out. It just bugged me. And, it's interesting, and I know you've probably shared this a lot with people that you've worked with. A lot of times the meaning you give something is more than actually we should be doing. Just move on, it's just the way it is sort of a thing. But what she was saying is, well, let's take a look at your cultural ancestry here and the fact that you have a claim that you have Native American culture in you. Look at that culture and what happened to them. Europeans came over and took away their lifestyle, their land, all of it. And so you have sort of inherited that, and that's what you see happening with you. And I thought, wow, that is a fascinating way to look at it.
It is, yeah. Speaking of ancestral karma, absolutely. I'm also thinking of Frank McKeown, one of the authors that was part of my research. He described how in Ireland he was doing this process that's described in the book where I call it stepping back into the ancestors. that's his term. I give him full credit for this. I've modified it slightly in the book, but basically the exercise is his, and I've gotten his permission to use it in the book. And what it is, it's slower than I'm going to describe it. Essentially, if you start with there's some music and breathing involved, and let's say you start by stepping back 2 or 3 paces. You take before you take some short, fast breaths, like start to access this altered state, and you move back into, then you become one or the other parent, mother or father. And you go through the description. What was that like? How did it feel? How did they feel towards the land? What was their relationship with others, et cetera, so that you start to get a feeling for what's going on with, let's say, Dad. And then after a bit, you take a few more of those sharp breaths, and then you step back, Grandpa. And then another cycle, Great-Grandpa. And then another Great-Great-Grandpa, even though you don't know them. And then the corker is on the final round, which I believe is the 5th. You step back into one of the ancient ones. And that's another phenomenon that's been occurring, Daniel, that I see more and more, is the old ones. Those who have been here, that have walked on the earth at one time, have transitioned through the spiritual realm, and have returned. And I believe they've returned in part to help us out during this time of, this transition that we're going through in the earth and human consciousness. Frank McCowan recounted how in Ireland, what happened, he did this with a group, and it was about the 2nd generation back. Suddenly this woman fell on her knees and was just crying and sobbing. And what basically they discovered was happening is she was reliving the period when the English took all the potatoes, which was their, one of their main sources of sustenance, and shipped them to the England, and people were starving. In the history, especially of Northern Ireland, I just finished this book, Malcolm Gladwell's excellent writer, David and Goliath, in which he recounts not only the potato famine in Ireland, which this woman was touching. So she was back to that before I move on. She was like grieving for an entire generation, not just her own ancestors, her own biological ancestors, but the people of the land that she was connected to. She was grieving for everyone that went through that 2 generations ago, and basically many starved to death because they had no potatoes. And then Malcolm Gladwell, I kind of went obliquely there, just off on a tangent, but he writes about the battles between the Protestants and the Catholics, and how the English came in 30 years ago and said, hey, we're going to take care of this right away. And they couldn't, because the Irish Catholics went underground and started guerrilla warfare, and that went on for 30 years up until, I think it's only been recently that there's been a calm and a peacefulness. Mm-hmm. So anyway, the pain of the Jews, if they are able to access that in 2 or 3 generations ago, they may go through a very, very similar experience, in that they're grieving and crying and sobbing and grieving for a whole generation, and not just for their biological ancestors. Like you said, cultural stuff, it's powerful. Right. Very, very powerful.
Now, I know there's an exercise, and you've got many in the book that are really fascinating for our listeners to explore should they decide they want to heal their ancestral karma. And again, it's partly about healing yourself, but it's also about helping to release those before you and those after you from patterns that maybe just don't serve us anymore. For whatever the reasons we have them, it doesn't really matter why you have it. It's that maybe you do, and maybe it's time to move on if it doesn't serve you. But the one exercise, and this is more on a personal note here for me, because you've certainly shared plenty of personal stories about your journey, is the one about visiting your parents' grave.
Wow.
Now, my biological father, he died at the age of 24, and it's pretty simple. He was a guy, he liked to party. He had 3 other sons outside of me, and then it was just probably about 6 years ago, I get a phone call and discover that I have an older sister that I never knew about. And so she was born probably about a year, maybe 2 at best, before I was. And he didn't seem to want to have anything to do with either of us, and so it kind of also makes you wonder, well, are there any other children out there that we don't know
Right,
about? But
yeah.
I know of 3 of them anyway, and I've actually talked to the youngest one who, interestingly enough, his name is Danny.
Huh.
Now, here's the thing. You know, I never knew him personally. I don't, you know, never seen him, none of that. And so I think it was in 1973 or 74 is when he died. And it was a high-speed car crash, and I got the story that he was at one bar, and that bar was about to close. And it wasn't that he was drunk or anything. He just liked to be out and you know, and enjoy himself. And I understand his thinking. But he had a friend who owned a bar, and he says, well, if you can get down here by this time, I'll let you in. You know, and he liked to shoot pool and that sort of thing. And so that's what resulted in the high-speed crash that killed him. But I sometimes wonder because, you know, what it would be like to go and sit in his grave. I've never been to a graveyard to visit anybody that I've known, family or otherwise. And I thought, what would it be like to actually sit there and see what comes through? You know, would this release me from something? Because as I came to have my own children, and eventually I did divorce my wife, who has my 2 children, but I was in their lives because inside of me, I just wanted my children to know who I was.
Right.
That was my whole goal as a father. Most fathers might think, hey, that's it for you. But that's big.
It's really big. Really big. Yeah, I separately, in my own process, I've got a daughter 35 and a daughter 32, which every time I say that, I go, really? You're that old?
Well, I'm
really?
a grandfather, for crying out loud.
Yeah, me too, Daniel. So we can bro out over that. You know, it's like, wow, really? But the beauty of it is my 2 daughters, Nicole, and they're doing so well in the world. I'm just like, okay. You know, there's an old saying, they're doing well in spite of me, but I'm kind of over that. No, I realized I contributed to their lives. And, you know, I had my flaws and everything, but one of the things I went to them a few years separately. I went to them separately or talked with them separately because I recognized I really was not there as much as I could have been, I think. And I wasn't completely checked out, but, you know, tired, blah, blah, I told you earlier. But I went to Nicole, my oldest daughter, God bless her, you know, and I said, you know, I have to make amends with you. I got to tell you, I'm really, really sorry for not being there for you at the times when you needed me. And so then we got into this, like, really cool conversation, you know, and she expressed her feelings about it. I heard her. I didn't argue. I just said, you know, you're absolutely right. You know, when she'd say something that was an accurate perception and an incident that, you know, I had forgotten about that she remembered. But I recognized that. I acknowledged that. I said, you're absolutely right, and I'm really sorry for that. And so we talked for probably about 40 minutes and cleared a lot. And there have been a couple other times since then that it's cleared. And now it's like now I feel at peace with her, and I know she feels at peace with me. It's like clean it up when you can. And then I right around the same time, Daniel, I called my youngest daughter, Catherine. And I said, you know, I'm really sorry. Same kind of thing. I really am. I'm really sorry for not being there more for you during the time when you were living with me, which was adolescence. And she this is so classic of Catherine. All she said is, oh, you did okay, Dad.
Yeah.
You know, like, she was done with it. Like, she didn't have harbored any ill feelings or anything. Like, Nicole had a lot of feelings that she had to express. But for Catherine, it was more like, no, I think you're all right. You did okay. And that was pretty much the conversation. Well, thank you. And no in-depth, you know, pouring out of feelings or anything. It's just a difference in their, kind of like you said earlier, that story about the two brothers that went, you know, a little bit more extreme, but went to 2 different paths and had 2 different perceptions. It's fascinating.
Well, it really is, and I think you bring up something that's really important. I almost sometimes think it's mankind's greatest sin, and that is guilt. And guilt, more times than not, prevents us from doing what we should be doing, what we know is necessary to be doing. And in your story right there, it sounds like the big hurdle for you was to overcome the guilt, to be honest of the fact that, look, I really did the best I can, but I want to let you know if I fell short, I'm really sorry about that. One says, well, okay, let's have a great dialogue about this. I feel better now. And the other one says, hey, what are you worried about for? You were a better dad than you thought you were.
Yeah, isn't that funny? And you mentioned the gravesite. I encourage you, Daniel, to go and just sit there and just listen. And I mean listen with all of you.
Right.
See what happens, address and call on your father. And it's a kind of a different way to get to know him, from the afterlife. The story that I think you referred to is I did that, again, early on before I even thought of ancestors or shamanism. I was just beginning to work with some shamanic processes, come to think of it. I went to his gravesite. It was shortly after he was buried. And I just sat with him, and I actually, I confess, I was sitting there, and I went in. Sometimes I use a drum or a rattle, and that takes me into an altered state, makes me just puts me closer to that veil and possibly through it. And I'm sitting there in the middle of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, at the grave in this cemetery, and I'm rattling. There's some people, about 50 feet away, and I'm just thinking, they're probably thinking there's this weird guy from California, over there.
Right.
But, it didn't matter.
Berkeley students from the 60s.
Yeah, one of those guys, something like that. But, very distinctly, I got messages to take back because we had just buried my father, so the family was still there, most of the extended family. And I went back with messages from my father. For instance, my sister I mentioned, Jim, her husband, was alive at the time. And again, this is many years ago. And I sat with him out on the porch, and I told him exactly what had happened and also the message I wanted to deliver. He wanted me to deliver to Jim. Jim is... I said, what he said to me to say to you is, thank you for taking good care of my daughter. Mm-hmm. And Jim, who was smoking a cigarette at the time, froze, and his eyes got really big. And all he said was, really? I said, yeah, that's the truth. He took a deep breath, and then took another puff of his cigarette and just kind of got really dreamy there for a few minutes. And you know what? He got it. Even though he wasn't necessarily delved into these kind of arenas, he believed what I said to him, and truly I had delivered this message. He was very touched. His eyes even got a little weepy and wet. And that was one of the... Oh,
just say that he cried. We know that he cried. We're crying now.
He cried, yeah, okay. I admit it,
Men can cry, it's a good thing.
My John Wayne voice comes out, all right, we cried. And my sister, the message to her was, thank you, I love you as my own daughter. Mm-hmm. And of course she cried, she was touched by that. But, so that, if any of your listeners, you mentioned, maybe you like to do it, but I certainly support you in that. But any of your listeners, go sit by the gravesite, just see what happens. My brother, who died, 17 years ago, his ex-wife, his widow, who's since remarried, but his widow, every year on his birthday, takes a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and goes and sits by his grave, pours him a glass. This is such a great ceremony. Pours him a glass of wine, herself a glass of wine, and has a conversation with him.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, and so the ancestors live. They just live in a different way. Mm-hmm. And they are available to us, especially, again, those who we're closest to.
Healing Ancestral Karma is the book, and our guest today, Dr. Stephen Farmer, joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program. Is there a website people can find out more about the book? I know that I'm on one now called earthmagic.net, which talks about the ancestor chant or song, how you can call them to you, which is pretty simple. But is there also another website as well?
That's the best one to go to.
The earthmagic.net?
Yeah, years ago I had set this up. The drstephenfarmer.com will take you there, but that's sort of the umbrella, earthmagic.net. I want it to be more than just about me, although a lot, and my work, although a lot of it is. And, there's a newsletter. People can sign up for that once a month. It comes out with, articles and, my schedule and where I'm going to be and what I'm up to and all that. There's free oracle card readings, articles galore on that website. Yeah, it's a good one. It's just a lot of material there, a lot of fun. So, I invite people to go and just explore it and see what you think. And you can write me if you want through the website. So it's a great place to go as a resource for this sort of thing. And yeah, you can order the book and my other books too through that website.
And that's at earthmagic.net, spelled just pretty much the way you say it there. And I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the program today. And there's such a bigger subject that we could talk about here. I mean, we could have talked about physics and quantum and all that, how the information's all there. I mean, there was really a lot to this here. And I encourage our listeners, take a look at this. It's really something that will get you thinking about, what is my next step? And more importantly, will you take that step once you know what it is? And that's the most important thing, is to take action. Yeah.
Well, again, Daniel, I thoroughly enjoyed it. You've got a lot of wisdom, I can tell.
Yeah, it's my ancestors. They won't leave me alone. Dr. Stephen Farmer, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Oh, thank you, Daniel, and thank you, listeners, and God bless.
You betcha. Again, Healing Ancestral Karma is the book. You can also discover more. Visit us at beyond50radio.com as well. There'll be a link there, and you can also sign up for our free weekly e-news updates as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.